This week we have a good example of what historians often do best: disagree. In this case, the disagreement concerns what happened to the Roman Empire in the West. You might think, well, it fell. Everybody knows that. It is true that during the 5th century, northwestern Europe was made up of Roman provinces. Then, by the 6th century, the same area was filled with kingdoms, kingdoms ruled by Germanic-speaking peoples that we, like the Romans, often describe as barbarians. On this, there's not much disagreement. How this happened and what it means are altogether different matters. Were these migrations or invasions? Did the barbarians destroy the Roman Empire, or was it more of a transformation? Indeed, one scholar has suggested that the Romans were critical actors in this transformation, that the barbarian kingdoms, as they are sometimes called, were Rome's, quote, last creative act. How could anyone argue that it wasn't an invasion? The Romans considered these people as distinct. They ate funny stuff, not olive oil, but rather butter. They drank beer rather than wine. They wore their hair long and dressed in tight-fitting trousers rather than loose-fitting tunics. They even wore fur. Disgusting. Furthermore, these folks were not pacifists. The Goths slew an emperor in the east in 378, and other Goths sacked Rome in 410, an event more calamitous in the minds of contemporaries than 9/11 was for us. At the time, some said, told you the whole Christian thing was a mistake. No barbarians sacked Rome when Jupiter was in charge. St. Augustine felt compelled to write The City of God to explain, in several hundred pages, why the sacking of Rome was not the end of the world. This sounds a lot like an invasion. As one scholar put it, Roman civilization did not die a natural death. It was assassinated. Well, if Rome was assassinated by invasion, it was not the stuff of science fiction. The barbarians were not unimagined aliens who suddenly appeared at the Roman frontiers. They were settled agriculturalists who lived nearby. They were neighbors and traded with the Romans. Indeed, some had become fairly Romanized. They even developed a taste for wine. They were also enlisted as allied troops to reinforce Roman garrisons. Some even had become Christians, of a sort at least. So what happened? Why did these strange but generally peaceful neighbors forcefully migrate, invade, and settle within the boundaries of the Roman Empire? Simple. They were pushed. They were pushed by the real barbarians, the Huns. On the Roman frontier, the barbarians were farmers. But farther along to the east, the barbarians were nomads, not farmers. And these nomads rode their horses along a superhighway, the Eurasian steppes. This strip of grassland stretched with a few interruptions from modern-day Hungary to Manchuria, yes, near China. At either end of this superhighway, the nomads supplemented a rather difficult pastoral way of life, herding horses, sheep, and goats, with trading and raiding. Indeed, until the beginning of the 15th century, the barbarians of the steppes would interrupt and threaten the lives of Western civilization and Eastern civilization. At both ends of the steppes, there were breakdowns in commerce and failure of states and empires. These raids from the steppes created ripples, more like tsunamis at times, in the great pond of Eurasia. In the West, it looks as if these waves suddenly drowned the Roman Empire. Look again. The empire attempted to adapt. When it could no longer collect sufficient taxes to support the increased number of troops required to protect the frontiers, the Romans adapted their traditional offer of citizenship. They accepted barbarian confederations into the empire in return for military service. Because the Romans could no longer pay them directly, they allowed these groups to collect taxes from the peasants in the areas where they settled. Eventually, both the local strongmen generals and the citizens no longer looked to Rome or even distant Constantinople for protection. They relied upon local landlords. Local connections became all when imperial citizenship offered few benefits anymore. Life became poorer and simpler in many ways as this second ancient network, remember the Bronze Age network, was disrupted. The trade between East and West that Alexander the Great had in many ways created and Rome had maintained, Roman wine jars were not just found among the barbarians, but as far as India, was diminished. Beyond economics, the culture, that is, the collective learning that such a network permitted, was also affected. Smaller collective, less learning. However, it is important to note that just as Hellenistic culture did not collapse with the death of Alexander the Great or the absorption of the successor kingdoms by Rome, Roman culture did not entirely evaporate when the empire in the West no longer existed. First, the barbarians did not kill, expel, or displace the citizens of the provinces. There may have been hundreds of thousands of barbarians, but there were millions of Romans. Likewise, these new barbarian kings were often married to Romans, and for a time many people continued to refer to themselves as Romani. Eventually, they began to create identities suited to their circumstances. They became Franks. They became Burgundians. However, the dream of recreating the imagined peace, prosperity, and power of Rome did not disappear. In their own ways, each of the heirs of Rome gave rise to restoration efforts. In the West, barbarians such as Theodoric the Ostrogoth, ally of Constantinople, and later Charlemagne sought, unsuccessfully, to restore something like the stability of the Roman Empire. The Byzantine Emperor Justinian unsuccessfully attempted to restore a larger imperial system, but according to many scholars, did more harm than good. Even Islam, while not attempting to restore Rome as such, had the ambition of recreating a community large enough to absorb all that Rome had been and more. No one succeeded in restoring the kind of imperial juggernaut that Rome had been. The West divided into barbarian kingdoms. Territorially, Byzantium was a shadow of itself when shorn of its possessions in Syria and Egypt by Islam. Even Islam became divided between Sunni and Shiite and also along ethnic lines. And yet, if we recall how the competing Greek polis were united by the ideology of Panhellenism, by a culture rather than a common state, the heirs of Rome accomplished a similar feat, similarly imperfect in many ways as well. In the West, Charlemagne helped lay the foundation for a Catholic Church whose institutions, led over time by the papacy, would create an idea of Western Christendom that functioned in some ways like Panhellenism. The divided kingdoms of the West would share religious and cultural ideas that bore the mark of Rome. Similarly, Byzantium may have had its territory continually diminished, but through its role as the leader of Orthodox Christianity, it was able to create what some have called a Byzantine Commonwealth, stretching through Central and Eastern Europe. Kingdoms such as Russia and Serbia would bear the mark of Constantinople. Islam, though often fractured by sect and ethnicity, think Turks and Arabs and Persians, for example, would likewise develop a strong cultural, if not political, unity that would stretch from modern Spain to Central Asia. You can defeat an army, you can even capture an emperor or slay a caliph, but cultures are harder to bring to a decisive battle.